for a while before I left politics in 2000, at the end of 2001. And I was never able to, because I saw the
The Honourable, the President.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth, and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath of affirmation, announcements by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator H.R. Ian Roach, who is ill. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from His Excellency the President Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTT-SC. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTT-SC, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Ms. Stacey Cummings, whereas Senator H.R. Ian Roach is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of illness, now therefore I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Stacey Cummings, Attorney at Law, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 20th of February 2018 and continuing during the absence of Senator Ian Roach by reason of illness. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President St. Anne's, this 19th day of February 2018. Honorable Senators, the Senator is required to take the oath.
I, Stacey Cummings, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do solemnly affirm that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives. The Insurance Bill 2016 in the name of the Minister of Finance. Papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The response of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to the 12th report of the Public Accounts Committee, 2nd session, 2016 to 2017, 11th Parliament, on the examination of the report of the Auditor General on the public accounts of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year 2016. The response of the Auditor General to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to the 13th report of the Public Accounts Committee, 2nd session, 2016 to 2017, 11th Parliament, on the examination of the report of the Auditor General on the public accounts of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year 2016, with specific reference to the Ministry of Finance. The response of the Auditor General to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to the 14th report of the Public Accounts Committee, 2nd session, 2016 to 2017, 11th Parliament, on the examination of the report of the Auditor General on the public accounts of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year 2016, with specific reference to the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. The reports of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago for the years ended September 30, 2010 and 2011. The annual audited financial statements of Portfolio Credit Management Limited for the financial year ended December 31st, 2016. The annual audited financial statements of the National Information and Communication Technology Company Limited for the financial year ended September 30, 2017. The audited financial statements of MIC Institute of Technology, formerly Metal Industries Company Limited, for the financial years ended September 30, 2011 and 2014. The annual audited financial statements of National Enterprise Development Company Limited for the years ended September 30, 2015 and 2016. the ministerial response of the Ministry of Finance to the 9th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, 3rd session, 2017 to 2018, 11th Parliament, on the examination of the audited financial statements of the telecommunication services of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial years 2008 to 2016. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Children's Life Fund for the period from commencement of operations to September 30, 2012. And the report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Students' Revolving Loan Fund for the years ended December 30, 2005, 2006, and 2007. Thank you, Madam President.
Minister of Public Utilities.
The Minister of Public Utilities. Madam President, the Minister of Public Utilities, the Accounts and Enterprise Committee, 3rd session, 2017. Apologize, Madam Speaker. Madam President. Ministerial response of the Minister of Public Utilities to the 9th report of the Public Accounts Enterprise Committee, 3rd session, 2017-2018, 11th Parliament on the examination of the audited financial statements of the telecommunications services of Trinidad and Tobago, TSTT, for the financial year 2008 to 2016.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and the supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Trade and Industry. The annual administrative report of the Export-Import Bank of Trinidad and Tobago Limited, Exim Bank, for the years ended December 31st, 2015 and 2016.
Vice President.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in my name. The 40th Annual Report of the Ombudsman for the year 2017. The Sessional Review of the 2nd Session 2016-2017 11th Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam President, sorry. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and supplemental order paper in the names of the Minister of Public Administration and Communications and the Minister of National Security. The response of the Service Commissions Department to the 5th report of the Joint Select Committee on Local Authorities, Service Commissions and Statutory Authorities, including the THA, 3rd session 2017-2018, 11th Parliament on an inquiry into the efficiency and effectiveness of the Public Service Commission, the PSC. The ministerial response of the Ministry of National Security to the 4th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, 2nd session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament on the examination of the system of inventory audit within the public service. And finally, the ministerial response of the Ministry of National Security to the 3rd report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, 2nd session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament on the examination of the system of inventory control within the public service.
Reports from committees.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to present the following reports as listed on the order paper in my name. The 10th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, 3rd session, 11th Parliament, 2017-2018, on the examination of the audited accounts, balance sheets, and other financial statements of the National Entrepreneurship Development Company Limited, NETCO, for the financial years 2008 to 2014. And the 11th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, 3rd session, 11th Parliament, 2017-2018, on the examination of the audited accounts, balance sheets, and other financial statements of the National Maintenance, Training, and Security Company Limited, MTS, for the financial year 2008 to 2016.
Urgent questions?
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honorable Minister of National Security, in light of the recent protest action in East Port of Spain, what urgent measures are being put in place to guarantee the safety and security of persons who live in and travel through this area?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, what we saw Madam President, what we saw unfold yesterday was most unfortunate. But immediately, our law enforcement agencies moved into action. We had the first responders go and contain what was taking place. That was further supplemented with not only specialized forces from the TTPS, but also the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, and they continued working for the next 24-hour period as a unit and managed to bring under control what was taking place. Madam President, the joint forces of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force have put into place and into action their plans to deal with this situation. There continue to be a number of investigations taking place, and we saw, fortunately, a return to normality within a very short period of time.
Senator Mark.
Of course, yeah.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate to us how long would these joint forces remain stationed in the East Port of Spain community?
Minister.
Madam President, there are actually at least 2 camps of joint patrols and joint forces in the East Port of Spain area. So those would remain because they're there permanently, and it will be supplemented as needs.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether the government has analysed some of the problems that might have given rise to the protests that occurred yesterday, and what action the government would be taking?
2 questions.
Okay, Madam President, one question. Thank you, Madam President.
Minister.
The answer is yes. And the government, as it has already informed the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and as we've heard from the police service, and as this incident has once again highlighted, the government is moving to bring anti-gang legislation to the Parliament. The opposition are the persons who have stood in the way of that thus far. Correct. The Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the public recognize that this important piece of legislation is an important tool in the arsenal of the fight against what we saw yesterday, where it is an alleged gang leader, gang member, was shot by the police service, and that is what led to the protest. So if the opposition want to take the responsibility of keeping the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago in the dark and preventing anti-gang legislation, that is their choice.
Next question.
I cannot respond to him.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Madam President, through you, to the Honourable Minister of Rural Development and Local Government. In light of reports that a garbage truck driver was threatened into dumping garbage on the street in East Port of Spain yesterday. What measures are being put in place to protect garbage truck drivers working in the said area?
Minister of Rural Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The incident yesterday was very unfortunate and regrettable. One for us all at a national level. The Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government does not see this type of behavior as a norm. And for the future, we are strongly against this type of behavior. Many of the residents of that area work at the corporation and have time and time again cooperated with the Port of Spain City Corporation and the municipal police on a daily basis. The Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government is committed to ensuring safety of all workers, contracted or otherwise. We aim to avoid these types of isolated incidents in the future by continuing to work closely and building ties within the community. I thank the Honourable Member for his question and the concern for the citizens' safety, which we both share. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, did the Honourable Minister indicate whether his ministry intends to meet with the relevant union to discuss future developments involving a similar situation probably reoccurring? Does the government intend to meet and treat with the unions to address that question in the future?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I thank the member for his supplemental question. And as soon as the incident occurred yesterday, I requested an update from the Mayor of Port of Spain, and these talks we have are ongoing, but I made a special request yesterday to meet with the union and the Mayor. It was supposed to be today. I had commitments. I'll try for tomorrow, but they are aware of our meetings as soon as possible.
Senator Mark.
To the Honourable Minister of Health, in light of the closure of 3 health centres, the Upper Laventille, Oxford Street and George Street health centres, as a result of yesterday's protests, what urgent measures are being implemented to ensure that patients whose appointments were cancelled are otherwise facilitated?
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And let me bring some clarity to the issue. It was not 3 health centres closed, it was 4. 1, the Upper Laventille Health Centre. Yesterday was an antenatal clinic and pap smear days. All those patients have already been rescheduled to Monday. These are non-acute, non-life-threatening cases. Success Laventille, yesterday was GP clinic day. It was a walk-in clinic day. 71 persons were seen and 22 dressings done. The facility was then closed at 12 noon. There is no rescheduling to be done because yesterday was a walk-in clinic, non-acute, non-life-threatening. George Street, yesterday was also a walking day. 56 patients were seen, 19 dressings done. The facility was then closed at 1:30 p.m., has reopened today, as has Success Laventille, as has Upper Laventille. Because it was a walk-in clinic, non-acute, non-life-threatening, there is no rescheduling to be done. The 4th one, Oxford Street, which was in the heart of the problem, was quite properly closed yesterday and remains closed today. However, yesterday was a walk-in clinic, and today is a child welfare clinic. Again, non-urgent, non-life-threatening, and they will be rescheduled. May I add, Madam President, clinic appointments are never for acute or life-threatening cases. All these cases are always facilitated at a secondary or tertiary facility, like a Port of Spain hospital, Eric Williams, Arima District Health Facility. So none of the 4 health centers were affected was seeing any acute cases or life-threatening cases. And in 2 of the cases, Success Laventille and George Street, no rescheduling has to be done. Upper Laventille has already been rescheduled for Monday, and we will open Oxford Street tomorrow for child welfare.
The time is up.
Thank
Senator Ma.
I'll go directly, Madam President, to the Honourable Minister of Works and Transport. In light of recent protests by residents of North Oropouche Road, Sangre Grande, who are pleading for the road known as Budo Highway to be repaired, what action is being taken by the ministry to alleviate the plight of said residents?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam President. Madam President, the Ministry of Works and Transport is responsible basically for the highways and the major roadways. Budu Highway, it may be called Budu Highway, but it is not a highway. It is actually... Sorry.
Honourable members, the time for urgent questions has expired. Will you allow the Minister to finish his answer? Yes? Minister, continue.
Okay. Budu Highway is actually a private development, and the road is referred to as Budu Highway. It is an orphan road. It has never been handed over to the Sangre Grande Regional Corporation. There have not been any requests from the councillor to the Ministry of Works for any assistance, and my information from the chairman of the Sangre Grande Regional Corporation, the road was not placed by the councillor on his list of priority. I thank you.
Questions on notice?
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, the government is pleased to announce that it will be answering question number 17, question number 34, question number 35, and question number 44. We seek a 2-week deferral to question number 15 and question number 32.
Senator Mark.
Question number 17 to the Honourable Prime Minister.
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the Prime Minister has travelled 8 times over the period June 1st, 2016 to September 30th, 2017. The total cost of the Prime Minister's travel, including that of the official delegations, is $2,025,323.32. The visits and trips are as follows. On the 2nd to the 4th of the 6th month, the 7th Summit Heads of State and the Government Association of Caribbean States in Cuba. 6 persons accompanied the Prime Minister at a total cost of $129,544.50. That was followed by the 37th regular meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government of CARICOM in Guyana. 10 persons accompanied, $157,310.40. So for 10 persons to travel with the Prime Minister, $310.40. The third visit was when he traveled to Jamaica, a contingent of 14, and that was $249,447.47. The fourth trip was when he went to Caracas, Venezuela, to sign with President Maduro a cross-border gas. That was in December 2016. 16 persons went, $242,138.91. The fifth trip was another CARICOM Heads of Government meeting in Guyana, 11 persons at a cost of $188,572.07. The sixth trip was his trip to Houston, where he completed the discussions with respect to upstream gas contracts, met with Shell, EOG, and BP. 7 persons traveled with him at a cost of $269,059.62. The seventh trip was his trip to Chile, where 15 persons traveled with him at a cost of $599,178.03. The 8th trip was another Heads of CARICOM meeting, 9 persons in Grenada at a cost of $190,072.32. Madam Speaker, those 8 trips totaled $2,025,323.32. And what the country has seen and the taxpayers have seen is a significant savings in the cost of a Prime Minister traveling on official business during this period.
Could the Honourable Minister inform this House what were some of the tangible benefits accruing to the people of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago as a result of this expenditure of over $2 million, Madam President?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Absolutely. For example, the trip to Jamaica was a necessary trip. The Jamaicans had been complaining, the business community, that they had been neglected by the previous administration for the 5-year period, and in fact there was a deterioration in the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica between 2010 and 2015. The Prime Minister led a delegation there, along with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, included one of the members of the opposition. That relationship was mended, and now we have, as a result, free trade taking place once again. The trip to Houston, again, as a result of the neglect of the former administration with the energy sector. When we came in, there were a number of expired contracts. There was no upstream contract and no upstream supply of gas to NGC from the year 2019 going forward, because the former administration did not see it fit to negotiate a single gas contract during their term in office. So again, the Prime Minister managed to go there and secure gas for Trinidad and Tobago from 2019 going forward. The trip to Chile, again, it was an invitation of the former president, Michelle Bachelet, and they are the largest trading country in South America. As a result of that, there are now a whole host of opportunities for Trinidad and Tobago, and they are the single largest importer of Trinidad and Tobago LNG. Madam Speaker, all of the CARICOM trips, the tangibles are, once again, the former administration, and we remember the leader of the former administration making a most insensitive comment about Trinidad and Tobago not being an ATM for CARICOM neighbors. Once again, Trinidad and Tobago is at the forefront of leadership of the CARICOM and is now well respected once again.
The Honourable Minister provide this House with information as it concerns negotiations for gas prices that occurred in Houston, Texas, involving the Prime Minister and officials from EOG, Shell, and BPTT. Could you tell us if the Prime Minister engaged in gas price negotiations with those multinational corporations whilst he was in Houston, Texas?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, as has been said time and time again, including in the Parliament, what took place there was the culmination of protracted negotiations that had been taking place between NGC, BP, and EOG for a long period of time. If these negotiations were not concluded, Trinidad and Tobago would not have an upstream gas supply to NGC, and therefore its whole downstream industry would have come to a complete crash. What the Honourable Prime Minister did there is out of the influence of his position in his office. He went there, and we were in contact throughout with the technocrats at the Ministry of Energy and at NGC, and with the highest levels of leadership of both EOG and BP, we managed to conclude prices for gas going forward from 2019. In fact, in the meeting with the EOG president and the various vice presidents, as soon as the discussion had been concluded and a gas price agreed from 2019 to 2023, the president turned immediately to his vice presidents and said, begin the continued exploration of additional wells in Trinidad and Tobago. That type of leadership had been lacking for many years in Trinidad and Tobago.
Could the Honorable Minister indicate whether it was lawful or illegal for the Prime Minister to negotiate gas prices in which it was moved from $240 per standard cubic feet to close to $5 with the EOG that is today resulting in a crisis?
Question. You have one more question if you need.
Madam President, since the Honorable Minister has indicated to this House that the Prime Minister negotiated and concluded new gas prices, could he inform this House what were these new gas prices that the Prime Minister negotiated and concluded with these multinational corporations without technocrats at his side?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd like to correct the record. As usual, the leader of the Senate bench has misled the population of Trinidad and Tobago. There is absolutely no gas price to Trinidad and Tobago of $5 by EOG. I can only assume that is an attempt to mislead current things going on. He did say it was $5 from EOG. Little boy. Madam President, it was completely legal what the Prime Minister did, and as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, we would like to thank him for assisting in the conclusion of these negotiations.
Next question, Senator Mark.
The Prime Minister is in trouble. We have more information on this matter, sir.
Senator Mark, next question.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I now go to, is the question 34? Is 32 left out, ma'am? Or is 32 okay, ma'am?
32 was deferred? Yes, for 2 weeks.
Deferred, right. So I go to 34?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Question number 34 to the Honorable Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, on Sunday, the 15th of October, 2017, the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries received a report of an oil spill at Carrera Island, Chaguaramas. Following the receipt of the report, the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries immediately initiated action to clean up and arrest the oil. In parallel, the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, in concert with the Institute of Marine Affairs, the Environmental Management Authority, the Maritime Services Division, and the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard, conducted aerial and maritime surveillance to determine the source of the spill and whether it was an ongoing event. The source of the spill was not identified from the aerial and marine surveys. As a consequence, oil samples were collected from the oil-affected area at Chaguaramas by the IMA and EMA for the purpose of oil fingerprinting. The samples were found to be characteristic of bilge oil and not crude oil or refined oil in origin. Bilge oil represents a mixture of fuel oils and waste oil immersed in wastewater in ships and barges. Oil samples were then taken for fingerprinting from the vessels which were docked at Chaguaramas on the 14th and 15th of October 2017, and which were potential sources of the oil spill, as well as inland oil storage and remediation facilities. The fingerprinting of the oil spill at Chaguaramas showed similarities with samples taken from one of the vessels and an almost identical match with the samples taken from the slop tank of another vessel and in the storage pit of an inland remediation facility. Based on this evidence, the oil spill has been narrowed to the vessel with the identical match, and accordingly, appropriate action is now being pursued against the owner of that vessel. May I say both criminal and civil.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honorable Minister indicate to this House what was the cost to the taxpayers of the cleaning up of this oil spill that was released by this vessels or these vessels that he has provided to this Honorable Senate.
Minister.
Madam President, the cost is just slightly above $2 million TT dollars, which $2 million TT dollars, which we plan to invoke civil proceedings to recover for damages.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate to us the name of the company or agency that was responsible for carrying out this cleanup of the Gulf as a result of the oil spill that would have resulted in a $2 million bill?
Senator Mark, that question I won't allow. That doesn't arise.
Now that we have been told that the vessels have been identified that were responsible for this oil spill and narrowed down, could the Honourable Minister share with us, Madam President, the names of these vessels that were identified and how, well, I should stop because you'll tell me that, yes, the name of the vessels, ma'am.
Madam President, I'm advised by the attorneys that it will be inappropriate to name the vessels at this point in time before actual action is taken on behalf of the state and the Ministry of Energy.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate, therefore, when does the government anticipate, through the appropriate authorities, to commence proceedings of both a criminal and legal nature, Madam President, against those owners of the vessels identified by the Honourable Leader of Government Business?
Minister.
Madam President, I cannot give a specific time, but we will be acting with dispatch in this matter, and I would say in the shortest possible time.
No, no more. Yes. Next question, Senator Mark.
35 is okay, Madam President? Yes. 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 Question number 35 to the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the Basel II Accord is applicable to Trinidad and Tobago. Although Basel II is a voluntary standard, given its enhancements, it has become the standard adopted by a wide range of countries. The Basel II Accord was issued by the Basel Committee of Banking Supervision in 2004, and like its predecessor, Basel I, was initially designed for internationally active banks in the G10 nations. However, following its release, over 100 countries have adopted Basel II, either in whole or in part. In this regard, a number of countries in the Caribbean, for example, Barbados, Bahamas, Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Antigua and Barbuda, and in Latin America, for example, Argentina, Brazil, and Costa Rica, have adopted Basel II. Compared to its predecessor, Basel II significantly improves the risk sensitivity of the capital adequacy framework, as it treats with a wider range of risk facing financial institutions, including operational risk, interest rate risk in the banking book, and credit concentration risk. Basel II better aligns capital requirements with the risks to which banks are exposed and promotes more robust risk management and transparency. The implementation of Basel II/III framework has the following objectives aimed at strengthening financial stability and modernizing supervisory standards in Trinidad and Tobago. A, to establish minimum capital adequacy requirements and quantitative triggers for prompt corrective action. B, to provide incentives for licensees to improve risk and capital management. By enhancing the risk sensitivity of capital requirements, banks must add more capital as they take on more risk. And C, to ensure that licenses continue to maintain adequate, high-quality capital in excess of the regulatory minimum requirements and the capacity to absorb significant unforeseen losses. As reported in the Central Bank's 2016 Financial Stability Report, the bank rolled out Phase 1 of the Basel II 2/3 implementation plan to financial institutions licensed under the Financial Institutions Act of 2008 in November 2014 with an implementation date of 2018. Adoption of the Basel II Accord is not likely to have an impact on consumer loans and mortgage rates. Banks currently hold capital in excess of the minimum requirement, and based on impact studies conducted, banks will not be required to inject additional capital to meet the minimum capital requirement. However, it is noted that in the short term, the cost of implementation could increase as some licensed institutions implement new systems and processes to implement Basel II. Regulations will be required to give effect to the Basel II Capital Adequacy Standard. Specifically, Section 9(1) of the FIA 2008 states that the Minister, after receiving recommendations of the Central Bank, may make regulations for, among other things, prudential criteria. In addition, Section 9(3)(a) of the FIA states that regulations made in respect of prudential criteria include capital adequacy and solvency requirements and capital ratios in relation to licensees, financial holding companies, and members of financial groups. In accordance with Section 9(2) of the FIA, the regulations would be subject to negative resolution of Parliament. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister in the Ministry of Finance indicate whether the deadline given by the Governor of the Central Bank to the International Monetary Fund of an implementation date of June of 2018, would that particular date, Madam President, be met by the government of the Republic of TNT to have this Basel II implemented?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. To the best of my knowledge, we are on target to meet the date set, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Would not the Minister agree that, having regard to the costs that it would result in implementing this Basel II Accord, that this cost would obviously be passed on to consumers in the Republic of TNT? And if that is so,
No, let's ask the first question.
Whether
the cost
will be passed on to consumers as a result of the cost of implementing Basel II.
Minister.
Madam President, the banks that operate in Trinidad and Tobago that are licensed under the FIA have been acting in accordance with the provisions of Basel II for quite some time, so we do not expect significant incremental costs in 2018. It is feasible, it is possible that they may pass on the cost, Madam President, but having looked at what is required, we don't anticipate that it should require an incremental or increase in cost to the customer. But the banks are at liberty to pass on costs as they do from time to time.
Madam President, the Honourable Minister indicate whether the government intends to embark on a program of education and sensitization to the population as it relates to the implementation of Basel II, given what you have described as its implications.
Minister.
The education of the public on financial matters of this nature are generally handled by the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. They do have an education program, and we expect that in due course they will advise the public as to the relevant implications of the standard.
Madam President, seeing that this is a voluntary association of countries in the G20 grouping, would it mean, Madam President, that we are compelled to adopt this Basel II Accord, or are we willingly proceeding to adopt that particular accord? Is there a compulsion, Madam President, for us to adopt that Basel II Accord?
Minister.
As I indicated in my initial response, Madam President, it is voluntary. We are not required to do so. But having regard to the fact that we are part of an international community and that our banks do have corresponding banks outside of Trinidad and Tobago, it would be prudent for us to adopt these standards. It also provides greater protection for the public of Trinidad and Tobago, since it requires the bank to observe certain protocols in respect of risk. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Question number 44 to the Honorable Prime Minister.
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, a financial feasibility for the proposed Sandals and Beaches Resort in Tobago was presented by SRI, Sandals Resorts International, to the government before execution of the Memorandum of Understanding. This feasibility study showed a positive return on investment of the order of 10%, exclusive of other benefits such as local improved airlift to and from Tobago, international marketing of Tobago, purchase of local goods and services in Trinidad and Tobago, stimulation of the local agricultural sector, increased tourism tours, and all of the other benefits that redound with a project of this nature.
Senator Hussain.
Can the Minister indicate what is the monetary value of the 10% that you refer to?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Not at this stage.
Senator Hussain.
Can the Minister indicate the capital cost of the Sandals project?
Minister.
Not at this stage.
President, could the Minister not at this stage tell us what? No, yeah, I will refuse. Could the Honourable Minister indicate to this House, Madam President, through you, what is the cost, or what was the cost of the feasibility study that was conducted? And, well, I should stop there.
Minister.
$0 to taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago.
Senator Mark.
I also asked the Honourable Minister which entity or organization was responsible for conducting this feasibility study at $0 to the people of
Madam President, that was answered in the original answer. The persons who incurred the cost for the presentation and for the feasibility study, Sandals Resorts International.
Madam President, before you leave, question.
I'm here.
Yes.
Yes.
May I advise that I'm invoking Standing Order 2715 as it relates, Madam President, to question 15 of 15. I think that was the one that was deferred for another period of time, Madam President. And Madam President, as I'm on my legs, can I ask you to invoke Standing Order 2716 as it relates to question number 13, which has been languishing, as you know, for a considerable period of time.
Honourable members, in respect of those two questions, Standing Order 2716 will be invoked.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, I hereby seek your leave to move the adjournment of the House today under Standing Order 17 for the purpose of discussing a definite matter of urgent public importance, namely the failure of the government to adequately ensure that the national security framework of Trinidad and Tobago is effective and efficient. The matter is definite because it pertains specifically to the failure of the Minister of National Security and, by extension, the government to protect visitors during the carnival season, as well as dispose of terrorist cells which have infiltrated our nation as confirmed by the Prime Minister. The matter is urgent because in the event that the Prime Minister's information is true, terrorist cells whose mandate is to disrupt the social fabric of Trinidad and Tobago are running loose throughout our nation. Additionally, the government's lack of decisive action, as indicated by the release of suspected persons linked to an international terrorist organization, is facilitating the development of these terrorist cells. The matter is of public importance because the government's failure to protect foreign travelers during the carnival season has left a dark stain on our celebrations, and this will negatively impact our nation's foreign direct investment. Furthermore, Madam President, the lives and well-being of every man, woman, and child are at risk when an internationally recognized terrorist cell infiltrates the nation. Every citizen must be vigilant in this dark hour, and the impetus is on the government to rid our nation of this looming threat. I so move, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, I have considered the motion and I am not satisfied that this matter as presented qualifies under this standing order. However, the Senator may wish to raise this matter under Standing Order 15.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Customs Act, and the Exchange Control Act be now read a second time. Madam President, Trinidad and Tobago finds itself in the middle of globally tumultuous times. We find ourselves as an island state, two islands comprising our state, faced with the ramifications and effects of freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and indeed the application of a form of ingenious enterprise by disingenuous people at times. In Trinidad and Tobago, we are not immune from the scourge of terrorism, from its associated linkage to the financing of terrorism, and more importantly, equally importantly, to the linkages to the cohort of money laundering and corruption. The world itself, Madam President, has bound itself together under several organizations. We as a country find ourselves involved in bilateral relationships and multilateral relationships, where we are called upon as a nation to subscribe to and to apply principles which can better the lives of our citizens in this country. This bill constitutes one of the measures, an umbrella of measures designed to bind us tighter to obligations and reciprocal enforcement provisions which guide our country. This bill, in seeking to amend 5 pieces of law and in 2 regulations, this bill seeks to treat with eliminating the financing of terrorism and therefore the entity of terrorism being starved. This bill seeks to treat with the issues of money laundering, tax evasion, suspicious transactions, and open border cross-flow mechanisms. This bill finds itself very relevant in Trinidad and Tobago, in particular in light of recent days' events. We find ourselves discussing as a Senate this afternoon the very material of concern which successive governments have had on their minds and which no doubt future governments will have equally on their minds. So, Madam President, to put this in some form of context closer to the heart of the bill, we are in the middle of working Trinidad and Tobago's requirements out. Our obligations are being tested, our efficiency is being tested, our technical compliance is being tested by two very important entities. That parent entity is the Financial Action Task Force, which is, of course, a combination of approximately 190 countries around the world in association, having adopted the FATF 40 recommendations and 11 immediate outcomes. And we find ourselves as a sub-regional group in a FATF-style body regional group, that is an FSRB, called the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, where 25 countries have come together, adopted the FATF-style regulations, taken the 40-plus recommendations and the 11 immediate outcomes, and said that these 25 countries, of which Trinidad and Tobago is a part and indeed a leader, should be tested against the FATF methodologies. This exercise commenced, Madam President, in the year 2005, and indeed, by April 2010, Trinidad and Tobago underwent FATF testing in what is referred to as the third round mutual evaluation process, where Trinidad and Tobago saw itself graduate from negative reflection by the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the implementation of the Financial Obligations Rules, and the implementation of the Proceeds of Crime Act. Four very important pieces of legislation, and of course the FIU regulations that are associated with the FIU Act. In April 2010, Trinidad and Tobago saw itself ticking off the boxes in what is referred to as technical compliance. And that technical compliance is, do you have, as a jurisdiction, the laws to treat with the financing of terrorism being prohibited, terrorist activity being prohibited, that proceeds of crime should in fact be forfeited onto the state so that if a crime is committed that you have that financial institutions and non-designated financial institutions and persons, that is persons described under Schedule 5 of the Proceeds of Crime Act, that you find yourself in a position of an obligation and a sanction. And so we graduated. In the period April 2010 to September 2015, Trinidad and Tobago underwent its third round merged to fourth round mutual evaluation by FATF through the CFATF as its FSRB. And in January 2015, Trinidad and Tobago was assessed by the international observers appointed by CFATF and FATF, because they work in tandem with joint group operation, to see whether we had achieved success not only in the technical compliance requirements, that is, do you have a law, but also in the efficiency or operational success requirements of testing whether your laws are at work or not. That fourth round mutual evaluation exercise in January 2015 really was a landmark one, because Trinidad and Tobago pushed itself forward to be the first country in the CFATF enterprise to be tested for fourth round mutual evaluation. Unfortunately, the first in the lineup was Trinidad and Tobago as a country testing waters which the rest of the world had not yet tested. Personally, I don't think it was prudent for Trinidad and Tobago to have volunteered itself to be first in line, but the fact is that we were. The observations that came about in our mutual evaluation report, which was presented at the plenary in September 2015, November 2015, and then adopted by the CFATF plenary in June 2016, demonstrated that Trinidad and Tobago was not ready for fourth round mutual evaluation, quite simply put. The takeaway from that fourth round mutual evaluation is that Trinidad and Tobago found itself placed into two jeopardies. which we are feeling right now. Number one, we were bound, because of the parameters of analysis and the results produced, we were bound to go into something called enhanced follow-up. The FATF methodology indicates that if you have not scored well in the methodology bracketing, that is, if you have 8 or more non-compliant or partially compliant ratings for technical compliance, if you have low or moderate level of effectiveness in 7 or more of the 11 effective outcomes, or if you have a low level of effectiveness for 4 or more of the 11 effective outcomes, associated immediate outcomes, that you will be placed in something called enhanced follow-up. That's the first jeopardy. The second jeopardy is that you may find yourself, depending upon the size of your economy, if the size of your economy is over $5 billion US, you are obliged to be considered as an individual entity whose jurisdiction may be deemed to be causing a risk to the international framework, and you go into something called the ICRG methodology process, the International Corporation Review Group process of the Financial Action Task Force. So Trinidad and Tobago found itself, number one, in enhanced follow-up in the CFATF process, and number two, in the ICRG identification in the FATF process. So we're under 2 forms of regulatory supervision. That required us to undergo a system where we are obliged to implement the observations of the 4th round mutual evaluation report. And secondly, we're obliged to make sure that our systems work. It's not good enough that you have laws relative to the proceeds of crime. How many cases do you have that are successful? How many anti-terrorism cases have you prosecuted? How many money laundering cases have you prosecuted? The effectiveness of your laws are equally unchallenged. But the effect of being first in line, as we were put into that position by the last government in the 4th round mutual evaluation process, is that the international agencies are now misinterpreting the FATF methodology and determinations, and our banking sector is placed in a position where they are fighting de-risking and removal of security backing and security and brokerage firms on a global level, because nobody quite knows how a 4th round entity should be treated. And that comes about because it's quite convenient for some of the international entities to de-risk you. Not because you deserve to be de-risked, but rather because your market lacks appetite. And therefore, what is an expensive method of operation for larger entities elsewhere, correspondent bankers elsewhere, etc., you may find yourself, as Trinidad and Tobago is right now finding itself, in a situation where the banking community is suffering loss of corresponding banking, and where the Securities and Exchange market maneuvering between jurisdictions that are elsewhere find themselves cut off. So that's the background and context to this particular piece of law. This bill, which proposes these amendments to these 5 laws. Specifically, Madam Speaker, Madam President, Trinidad and Tobago went to work upon receiving its mandate from the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, the 4th round mutual evaluation report. Specifically, the government went to immediate work to identify all the areas of technical compliance that had to be met. This bill treats with that. Specifically, Trinidad and Tobago saw the move towards our courts for 2 things. One, to improve the system in which the cases must move, that is the criminal justice system. Declogging, identification of backlogs, alternate measures, introduction of rules, etc. And more importantly, by looking at the laws which have to be operationalized in the courts and deciding how we could simplify them. This has been the work product, in large part brought about by the reflections of something called the National Anti-Money Laundering and Financing of Terrorism Committee. It's called the NAMLAC Committee, which is a multi-party committee of several government agencies, including the Director of the Office of Public Prosecutions, the Central Bank, the Securities Exchange, the Attorney General, the Finance Ministry, the Ministry of National Security, and a number of other entities sitting at the table and coming up with a reflective consideration on the laws. Specifically, Madam President, the bill today proposes to treat with the following recommendations from the FATF recommendations and the following immediate outcomes. Number 1, Recommendation 3, which treats with money laundering offense. 2, Recommendation 19, which treats with how you manage high-risk countries. 3, Recommendation 27, which deals with the powers of supervisors. 4, Recommendation 28, which deals with regulation and supervision of non-designated financial businesses and persons, DNFBPs as they're called. Recommendation 29, which specifically relates to the Financial Intelligence Unit. Recommendation 32, which treats with cash couriers. Recommendation 37, which treats with mutual legal assistance. Recommendation 40, which treats with other forms of international cooperation. Immediate outcome 2, which treats with international cooperation. And immediate outcome 6, which treats with the Financial Intelligence Unit. And these 5 pieces of law that we propose are to be amended, and the 2 FIU regulations which are to be amended, squarely relate to each of those recommendations and immediate outcomes. So let's dive into the meat of the bill. I'd like to say that the bill is deceivingly simple. I'd like to say that the bill belies the potential and impact for the changes of law that are recommended. It may not be that obvious to people as to how strong an impact this law may have. But permit me, Madam Speaker, to put this into some sharper context. Clause 2, which treats with the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, Chapter 1124. In the bill, we are proposing that we remove from the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, Section 22.2K. Now, Section 22.2K is a strict prohibition against Trinidad and Tobago, under the Mutual Legal Assistance Act, accepting matters which concern taxes. So 22.2K says, a request shall be refused where it relates to a criminal offense under the tax laws of a Commonwealth country. Now, that particular provision, of course, has its genesis in the Convention of the Inter-American Convention of Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters. That's squarely out of Article 9 there. But the world has so moved on against prohibition for inclusion of tax matters for criminal assistance, mutual assistance, that the world is now met with the Global Forum, the Financial Action Task Force, the European Council, the international and bilateral and multilateral treaties which treat with tax reciprocity, etc. The whole world has moved away from this. And our mutual evaluation report, specifically at paragraph 410, determined that Trinidad and Tobago was in default of its obligations to allow for the free flow and assistance in relation to tax matters, criminality in tax matters, and the recommendation was made that this is to be removed. The government agrees, the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee, the NAMLAC Committee agrees, the Director of Public Prosecutions agrees that this matter should in fact be removed, but in particular, it falls to be in harmony with the TIEA 1989, the Tax Information Exchange Agreements of 1989 and 2016-2017, the intergovernmental agreements which we entered into as a country back in 1989 and then with the United States in 2016-2017, treating with what everybody knows now as the FATCA position. It also finds harmony with the Global Forum position, where we, as 1 out of 145 countries, find ourselves in the peculiar and unusual and terrible position of being the only country in that entire grouping to be in default of the Global Forum formula, which is the European equivalent of the FATCA arrangements. So we propose that this be deleted. There is precedent globally for this factor, and we think that this is something that is worthy of support. The next clause, Madam President, really is a dynamically and significantly important clause. And this is to treat with amendments to Section 44 and Section 53 of the Proceeds of Crime Act. Dare I say that this is of nuclear proportions. And the reason is to be found in the language of the definition of what is criminal property and what is considered as money laundering under the Proceeds of Crime Act. The Proceeds of Crime Act, Chapter 1127, at Sections 44 and 45 in particular, are very instructive, and I invite all members of this Honorable Senate to consider it. Part 2 of this Act treats with money laundering. Section 43 treats with the definition of criminal conduct and, importantly, criminal property. Criminal property, in subsection 1 of that, Section 43, means property which constitutes the benefit to a person for criminal conduct or represents such a benefit in whole or in part, whether directly or indirectly. Criminal property is immaterial whether it was carried out for criminal conduct or it benefited in terms of criminal conduct, and criminal conduct constitutes an offense in Trinidad and Tobago. If it occurs outside, it is also to be treated that way. But Section 44 reads as follows: an offense committed under Section 45 shall be known as money laundering offense, and the term money laundering shall be construed accordingly. The existing law says that the offense of money laundering is an indictable offense. Section 45, a person who knows or has reasonable grounds to suspect that property is criminal property and who engages directly or indirectly in a transaction involving criminal property, receives, possesses, conceals, disposes of, disguises, transfers, brings into or sends out of Trinidad and Tobago that criminal property, converts, transfers, or removes from Trinidad and Tobago that criminal property, commits an offense of money laundering. Madam President, this offense of money laundering, the tie-back definition to criminal property, the tie-back definition to criminal conduct, applies to every single example of criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, it anchors into the financing of terrorism, to terrorist activities. It anchors into corruption, into white-collar, blue-collar, brown-collar corruption. It treats with corruption and illegality in the police service, prison service, immigration, customs. It treats with criminality in business enterprise. It treats with cartel-type behavior, even though that's not a strict concept of law, but in cooperation and facilitation under the bid rigging provisions, which will no doubt become very important as we operationalize the public procurement legislation. But suffice it to say, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the concept of money laundering, is a massively important prospect for sobering Trinidad and Tobago into lawful conduct and behavior. And that, Madam President, finds itself in the deletion of the offense of money laundering being an indictable offense, and now with the substitution, as we propose it, that in fact is an offense to be treated either summarily or indictably. And why is that? Because when we look to the performance indices of our money laundering cases, or forfeiture cases, etc., there are, according to matters coming from the Financial Investigation Bureau, 27 matters for money laundering, 359 charges. But, Madam President, none of these matters have reached the state of final conclusion. None. In fact, some of them started as far back as 2012. And this is a direct tie back to the state of difficulty that this country has in an effect, a consequence to crime being applied, because the matters are almost never ending in the indictable procedure route. And directly out of the office of the DPP at the NAMLAC committee, the recommendation came for the move to the inclusion of these matters as summary offenses, which is what this bill proposes. This ties in, as will become evident in the couple of months ahead of us, with the government's squarely focused agenda on following the money in crime. If it is going to be difficult to catch a criminal with a firearm or with drugs or with other aspects, following the money is going to become the avenue by which we can see some effect. More particularly when that is built upon the back of a removal of preliminary inquiries and a hybridizing of offenses and the route for summary offenses. Madam President, the time is particularly short in this House, so I may have to skip a little bit faster as I'm being warned about time. But suffice it to say, in our mutual evaluation report, our effectiveness under IO 7, immediate outcome 7, and under recommendation 3 demonstrated that we had to do something with this. And so we have in these amendments not only proposed adding in the summary route to this, but we've also taken care of another observation under the mutual evaluation report, which is the need to harmonize the quantum of the offense, the quantum of the sanction for the offense in keeping with the anti-terrorism legislation. And that is why the quantums expressed in this bill in respect of the summary offense and indictable offenses have been elevated and moved upward so that they're now in harmony with the Anti-Terrorism Act. Madam Speaker, Madam President, Clause 4 treats with amendments to the FIU Act and its regulations. And it traverses a number of issues. Simply put, we update the legislation in the reference to language, specifically with the new terminology that we make reference to in the reference to the Egmont Group. The Egmont Group is 152 financial investigation units that work together in tandem globally. And the reference in Clause 4.1a of the bill to the amendments in Section 2 to take care of the new reference to the Egmont Group is meant to tidy up language and consistency concerns. Secondly, when we amend by insertion of patterns, trends, and typologies, as we see in Clause 4.1b1 and Clause 4.1b2, where we insert definitions, we are now adding in tactical and strategic analysis for trends and typologies. These are terms of art used in the FIU Egmont Group context to allow for a different type of report and generation. But Madam President, the impact of the FIU must be factored in what we're seeing coming out of the FIU right now. Statistically, the FIU finds itself now, as a result of improvements facilitated by this government, with a 342% increase in compliance examinations when we compare the periods 2013 to 2017. We find ourselves with a 58% increase in suspicious transactions and suspicious activity report submissions. But really, if one were to look at the Financial Intelligence Unit report, the most recent one laid in the Parliament, Madam President, for the financial year ended September 30th, 2017. Let's put this into context in Trinidad and Tobago. The FIU has told our country that Trinidad and Tobago has witnessed an unprecedented development in its FIU transactions, where we have jumped effectively from the year previously, for the period, the cumulative money value for the entire period 2011 to 2016 for suspicious transaction reports and suspicious activity reports was 4.5 billion TT dollars. Listen to this. For the last year, that figure jumped, Madam President, to 22.045 billion. We've jumped from 4.5 billion for the cumulative period 2011 to 2016, and in 1 year, we've seen roughly $22.1 billion worth of suspicious transactions and activity reports. And because of the improved reporting requirements, we've seen approximately 13.6 billion of that stopped by way of effective intervention for just reporting the positions. So the amendments that we bring today for the FIU speak to the need for improvements, not only in the type and methodology of reporting, but very importantly as well, Madam President, in allowing the director of the FIU the ability to act in a spontaneous manner, to have action of the director's own motion. And that is specifically to take care of the situation where the FIU director was sitting there, legislatively incapable of informing of the need for someone else to be aware of something. And this marries in with the TIEA, FATCA, Global Forum, reciprocity and spontaneity provisions, and so the bill provides for this. Madam President, we also allow in the amendment to the regulations, particularly Regulation 19, we allow for that tie-in between the parent law spontaneity and the regulation spontaneity. Madam President, Clause 4.1c of the bill amends Section 12 of the FIU Act. And in amending Section 12 of the FIU Act, we are proposing for, again, an adoption of summary process for matters where we have disclosures required and one must approach the court for the court's assistance for a disclosure order being made, and we've prescribed in this law that it should be done on a summary route, again to increase the effectiveness. Clause 4.1d of the bill treats with amending Section 17.1, and that is again to take care of the phenomenon of how reporting is done. Reporting is not only done by the FATF entity itself, but it's also done by the 9 FSRBs, FATF-style regional bodies, CFATF just being one of those 9. So we're allowing for jurisdictions to be required to take knowledge and cognizance of recommendations coming out of the FSRBs themselves. Clause 4.1e of the bill importantly treats with amendments to Section 18 of the FIU Act. Now, Section 18 falls under Part 3A, which is the supervisory authority, and Section 18 of the FIU Act is a very important position for Trinidad and Tobago because it's there that we find the obligation to uphold and to find assistance for the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Anti-Terrorism Act, the Financial Obligations Rules, and the general provisions of law which require reciprocity, and those laws which fight evasion, financing of terrorism, and the proceeds of crime. And what we're allowing here is an improvement to secure compliance. Specifically, we're allowing for due process to go to work. We're allowing for a warrant to be issued for a police officer in circumstances where the FATF and CFATF felt that Trinidad and Tobago could do more to allow for cooperation by listed businesses and scheduled persons in Part 5 of the Proceeds of Crime Act. Schedule 5 of the Proceeds of Crime Act. The general law on the outside is that there should be no need for warrant, that people should have automatic entry. We are not trading our sovereignty nor our position in respect of our constitution. We have maintained the fact that you must have permission to enter places. You can go so through the voluntary participation of the entity whom you are knocking on the door, or if they refuse, you can go to the court and have a court issue a warrant allowing you to go in. But to allow for the answering of questions, which is a supplementation to subsection 1B of section 18G, which is the existing law, we've provided for the warranting to say you must comply, you must give information, you shall not willfully obstruct. We make it an offense for willful obstruction or for misrepresentation, etc. But very importantly, in recognition of the right against self-incrimination, which is a constitutionally entrenched right, we have made sure that nothing in this section shall be construed as requiring any person to give any information which may incriminate himself. And that's in the new 2E. Therefore, avoiding the need for any trampling of any constitutional right and relying quite properly upon the due process provisions, and one could even call it the Surat principle of the law going no further than it ought to, and it being proportional. Madam President, I jump quickly to the inclusion of an amendment to the provisions for the regulations in the Parent Act. Section 27 is where you put out that you may have subsidiary law or regulations made, but there was an omission in the parent law such that Section 63 of the Interpretation Act prevailed, and Section 63, as we all know by now, says it's going to be a summary offense, and your maximum penalty that you can suffer is going to be $500 if you breach a regulation. We have proposed to amend that to improve the regulatory sanctions by allowing for the inclusion of an exception to Section 63 of the Interpretation Act. Madam President, we've taken in the regulations an approach to harmonize the regulatory timeframes and prescriptions in line with the Companies Act. The timeframe of 6 months, etc., was just too long. We have harmonized it with what a notice of change of directors or secretary or registered office is under the Companies Act, and we have harmonized that down to the 30-day prescription periods that we have in the other laws of Trinidad and Tobago, bringing it in line with the Securities Industries Act and also the recent fulminations that we've had in the House relative to the insurance laws. Madam President, may I ask, do I end at 3:10? Thank you. 10 minutes to do justice to some big clauses. Clause 5, the Customs Act. Madam President, Customs is the 4th largest contributor to the GDP of Trinidad and Tobago. Customs is responsible for the supervision of the payment of taxes and customs duties. VAT flows from that. Customs duties flow from that. Income tax flows from that. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we have an archaic system of customs regulation where our post-audit function lies impotent. Because under the current laws in the Customs Act, we only have the ability to stop the particular shipment at the point in time. Under the current Customs Act, there's no obligation or requirement to keep your documentation for the same period as you're required to keep it for the Income Tax Act, which is 6 years. Under your Customs Act, the customs officer and the importer in equal circumstances where they don't have to keep their information for the necessary periods of time. Under the Customs Act, it is not an offense to treat with the evasion in a major sense of some of customs duties, etc. And there is rampant criminality in having a weak post-audit environment under the customs laws. And again, this particular amendment to the Customs Act, the proposed amendments are, in my humble opinion, the government's humble opinion, of significant importance to Trinidad and Tobago and in this bill. Specifically, number one, we broaden the definition of the territoriality of the operation of the customs laws, and we bring it in harmony with our laws which treat with our territorial waters, which are wider in scope. That's bringing us in harmony with the rest of the world. Number two, we improve the post-audit function as we see in Clause 5B. We're allowing in 5B1 that we move from 1 year from data entry to adjust value to 6 years. So that if you find that someone has dodged, that you can actually now say, if within the 6-year period, which is familiar to every businessman in Trinidad and Tobago, because that's your income tax prescriptive period, if within the 6 years we find out that new information concerning goods, or for any other reason that you have not declared properly, that you can fall to the supervision of the law. And that is very importantly tied to what the Ministry of Trade does, and what Customs does, and what Finance does, as we marry the Asecutor system. Because now declarations are on hand, and now the Customs has a much more whole-of-government approach to see who is actually telling the truth or not. Madam President, we also allow for the provisions to parallel amendments which we're making to Section 228 in Clause 5D of the bill. What we are specifically doing is we're making sure that there's now a power to refuse entry or delivery, as opposed to just treating with the goods that are now coming in. Because 6 years later, 5 years later, if you found out that you've been treated, you now have the authority as exists elsewhere in the Caribbean and in the models of law that we've looked at, including the CARICOM laws, where you can actually say, well, hold on, you got away on the last occasion, we've now found out that you didn't tell the truth, we've analyzed your provisions, but now your goods will be kept on hold. But that's not done in an arbitrary fashion. That is done in a fashion where we say you have the right to go to the Tax Appeal Board And we prescribe that. And we're also balancing it in the law where we're saying now, you not only have that right, but we're making sure that the customs must keep its records for the same 6-year period so that you can have the ability to find errant officers and corrupt officers as well as tax evaders and errant people in society. And therefore, there's proportionality and balance in the whole of law amendment approach that we're taking. Madam President, we're seeking as well to ensure that we treat with some of the things which ought to be prohibited. In today's world of criminality, the importation of bulletproof vests, scopes, firearm accessories, these things ought to be regulated. This bill now causes a prohibition without license of the commissioner in those circumstances, except if you're a licensed firearm holder and there are certain declaratory positions that have to happen. Madam President, we're giving further teeth to the post-audit mechanism in Clause 5D1. Specifically, as I referred to earlier, we're moving from 3 years to 6 years for record keeping, and we're ensuring that you are required to produce the information in a much shorter time. No longer 3 months to produce the information, 30 days or such time as may be extended, tightening the post-audit arrangements. Madam President, we're also allowing for the establishment of a criminal offense for failure to provide information. This is essential to getting Section 228, which we're amending, working. There are offenses prescribed in every other jurisdiction except Trinidad and Tobago. And so we have adopted the offense prescriptions in the existing Customs Act to be found in Sections 212 onward, where you have the penalty at $125,000. Understand that that's a maximum penalty and not the absolute penalty. It's within the discretion of the court or the controller in certain circumstances to apply less. Madam President, we are allowing for the insertion of the provision of orders or mutual cooperation between customs entities. Very importantly, Trinidad and the United States of America did a first-in-class, first-in-time, precedent-breaking, groundbreaking cooperation. On the 21st of September 2016, the U.S. and Trinidad and Tobago government signed the first customs mutual assistance agreement in Trinidad and Tobago. And this bill proposes that these forms of mutual agreement can come into effect by way of declaration of an order subject to negative resolution of Parliament so that we can have the benefit of international cooperation meeting the requirements not only of the CFATF and the FATF.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. 5 minutes left. Madam President, we're allowing for amendments to the Exchange Control Act. Specifically, there was a loophole, bearer negotiable instruments, which effectively are as good as cash, an instrument of value worth 10,000 US or 5,000 US or 50,000 pounds as a bearer negotiable instrument is a larger form of a dollar bill. The bearer has the value. And our laws did not provide for the regulation either in import or export for bearer negotiable instruments. This was a specific observation by the FATF joint group exercise and the CFATF exercise. And what we have done is we have harmonized how Trinidad and Tobago treats with cash and bearer negotiable instruments by applying the 5,000 US dollar imposition limit. There has been discussion as to whether we as a country should raise it to the 10,000 US limit as other countries have. No doubt that is something that can be attended to in terms of further considerations in any finance act, for instance, year on year. That's something which the government is looking at actively. But for now, the requirement is to harmonize it with cash and with other forms and instruments. Madam President, this bill gives us a whole lot. This bill allows Trinidad and Tobago to begin to position itself to where we want to go. If we're serious about treating about the scourge of crime in this country, one of the best ways to treat with it is to follow the money. One of the best ways to treat with it is to simplify money laundering. One of the best ways to treat with it is to simplify the post-audit function in customs. One of the best ways to treat with it is to improve the financial intelligence unit, which has shown such a marked increase in performance in this tenure of this government. one of the best ways to treat with it is to fill the lacuna in the exchange control legislation. One of the best ways to treat with it is to understand that this comes in a whole of government legislative approach, where we are simplifying the manner in which the courts operate, where we've analyzed the backlog on provisions, where we are improving the criminal administration system, the justice system, where we're delivering more capacity. As we march to the end of February and the beginning of March, we will be opening a family and children division of the court. For the first time, this country will see the opening of courts in Trinidad and Tobago. 19 pieces of law amended, all regulations done, 13,000 people interviewed, 2 court buildings procured out, because it's related to the criminal justice system. If you start to hive off and make systems work better, if you take 100,000 cases from the motor vehicle and road traffic arena and you hive those out, if you impose new rules of court and you start to make that work, we're headed in a whole of government perspective towards a solution, Madam President. And I urge honorable senators to take avail of the opportunity to lift us out of the circumstances that we're in, to have the international agencies observe us as a parliament taking steps in the right direction. The government is interested and open-minded with respect to the submissions that this honorable House will present. We are interested in seeing the law move in the right direction, not because others tell us we need to do it, Madam President, because we know we should do it, Madam President. It's common sense that it happen. And in those circumstances, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Customs Act, and the Exchange Control Act be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much. Madam President, let me begin by saying that we too, like the Attorney General, agree that we should eliminate the scourge of crime in our country. And we too agree that we should follow the money. We are also in favor of improving the FIU and its operations to make it more effective. But I want to tell you, Madam President, that we must all remember that we function under the rule of law, and you yourself as an attorney at law would understand the importance of the rule of law. There are certain fundamental principles, universal principles, that govern that concept. Apart from accountability and just laws, you have to ensure that there is open government. And you also have to ensure, Madam President, that there are mechanisms in place where you have resolution to dispute via impartial tribunals or bodies. Madam President, when we examine the provisions of the current piece of legislation that is before us, several provisions we find to be extremely draconian. We find several of them to be oppressive. And we find several of them, Madam President, infringe on the citizens' fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms. And what is more alarming, Madam President, there is no certificate attached to this piece of legislation that would require a special constitutional majority because of those violations that I will share with you in a short while. Madam President, I want to indicate that Trinidad and Tobago is not standing very well on the concept of the rule of law internationally. We are trending downwards in the rule of law. Madam President, I want to invite you to a publication called the World Justice Project, Rule of Law Index 2017 to 2018. And I want to tell you, Madam President, in this particular publication on page 6, it says, their definition of the rule of law goes like this. Effective rule of law reduces corruption, which we support. It combats poverty and disease and protects people from injustices, large and small. It is the foundation for communities of peace, opportunity, and equity, underpinning development, accountable government, and respect for fundamental rights. The rule of law is not just the rule of lawyers and judges, but all members of society as stakeholders. I just want to put that on the record, and I will point out to you as I move on where we are trending downward in terms of the rule of law internationally as defined by this publication. Madam President, the Attorney General in his presentation made reference to the Mutual Assistance Act. Madam President, I am sure that my colleague mentioned this matter of, in fact, it's the first amendment to the Act, which is the mutual assistance in criminal matters. And it, very, very simply, he tells this Honorable House that international advice says that we must remove Section 2, subsection K, which deals with, right now the law says we shall refuse. So the government is now saying we delete K and make what he calls, remove this as a criminal offense, a request that is, under the tax laws of a Commonwealth country. So we are removing this, and the basis, Madam President, for its removal is to follow the money and to deal with tax evasion. But I want to remind him about legislation that we have passed. No employee of the Board of Inland Revenue, Madam President, who has sworn to an oath of secrecy can give out any information of any taxpayer in this country. And I want to remind you, Madam President, some of my colleagues will elaborate on this a little further. But I want to remind this House, Madam President, that when we dealt with FATCA, the government had to bring an amendment to the Board of Inland Revenue in order to make exceptions. This government is seeking to amend this act by leaving out the Board of Inland Revenue. So I want to advise the Honorable Attorney General that there are gaps in this legislation that requires critical attention and evaluation. And I want to say from the very outset, we on this side will be proposing that this matter be sent to a joint select committee so that we can have a greater degree of searchlight and floodlight on its provisions, Madam President. Madam President, I want to also let you know from the very outset that whilst we support the Honorable Attorney General, we cannot in any way ignore the Constitution of our Republic. And when we make legislation and we seek to pass new laws, the supremacy of the Constitution must be recognized, and particularly sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution. Madam President, if I invite you to join me and we journey to clause 2 of this legislation, it deals with what is called section 3, proceeds of crime. Now, the Attorney General avoided that section somewhat, although he gave a little insight. But what the Honorable Attorney General did not share with us is that under the current Proceeds of Crime Act, there is only what is called an indictable offense. But the government has now decided to go with both summary and indictable. And whereas in the past, the indictable was $25 million and or 15 years imprisonment, the government has now moved that to the summary portion of the act, and the government has now introduced on conviction, on indictment, a new provision that says, Madam President, $50 million and imprisonment of 30 years. Now, the Honorable Attorney General did not share with this Honorable House what is the basis for this draconian shift in the legislation. Because we have to understand there's something called human dignity in this country. And I also want to recognize very early, Madam President, that in the Constitution of the Republic of, Mr. Vice President, I beg your pardon. In the Constitution of our Republic, Mr. Vice President, there is Section 5 of our Constitution, and subsection 2, subsection B states that without prejudice, that is 2, to subsection 1, but subject to this chapter and to section 54, Parliament may not impose or authorize the imposition of cruel and unusual punishment or treatment. This is a provision in law. And therefore, the Attorney General and the government just cannot increase the fine from 15 million to 50 million and from 50 years to 30 years. You have to come here and justify that. Because we are arguing and submitting to you, Mr. Vice President, this is in violation of Section 5 of our Constitution. And, Mr. Vice President, I would like to share with you, if this section, as we are arguing, is breached, then Section 13(1) kicks in. It kicks in because you need a special 3/5 majority if you are going to impose cruel treatment and unusual punishment. I want to also remind you that we are a signatory to what is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states that no one, in Article 7, shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. That is a human right. And we are a signatory to this human right under the Civil and Political Covenant, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I also want to let you know, and maybe the Attorney General can refer to this particular judgment by Justice William Brennan in 1972 in the case of Furman versus Georgia in the U.S. court. And what he was able to establish is that there are 4 essential areas that we must look at when we are defining cruel and unusual punishment. The first one he indicated in that judgment is the essential predicate is that a punishment must not, by its severity, be degrading to human dignity, especially torture. That's the first principle that we must be guided by. The second principle is a severe punishment that is obviously inflicted in a wholly arbitrary fashion. This is an arbitrary imposition on the country and this Parliament. The Honorable Attorney General offered no justification and or rationale for this particular imposition. That is why I started off, Mr. Vice President, by outlining that Trinidad and Tobago is run and governed by the rule of law. And in spite of whatever might happen in this country, I want to warn this government, we in the opposition are the watchdogs of the people's constitutional rights and freedoms. And no terrorist plot or riot in Port-of-Spain will get us to underwrite and to undermine and to subvert the fundamental rights and freedoms of the people of this country. Mr. Vice President, we have seen this happen in many jurisdictions. They use fear and security tactics in order to abridge and subvert the rights and freedoms of the citizens. That will not happen so long as the United National Congress is alive in this country. I want to warn the government about that. Let me go to the third principle, a severe punishment that is clearly and totally rejected throughout the society. And the final principle, a severe punishment that is patently unnecessary. Mr. Vice President, the United States Supreme Court, through this judgment, set the standard that a punishment would be cruel and unusual if it is too severe for the crime, if it is arbitrary, if it offends society's sense of justice, or if it is not more effective than a less severe penalty. So we are arguing very early in this submission that the government of Trinidad and Tobago has brought forward legislation, Mr. Vice President, that when we examine it, infringes citizens' fundamental rights. And if you are going to institute measures, you must be able to come and justify, and you must offer the proper rationale for why you are doing so. Not because FATF tells you that, or CFATF tells you that. Our Constitution is supreme in the Republic of TNT, and we must protect Section 4 and 5 jealously at all times. That's the first area. The second area I drew to your attention, Mr. Vice President, if you want to remove 22K, please amend the Inland Revenue Act and come with a special majority. You cannot go and ask an inland revenue worker to simply give out information, Mr. Vice President, on your taxes or my taxes. That is a breach of my rights. And you must get the constitutional majority for that breach if you are going there. And does that not tell you why the government wants to bring something called a revenue authority, where the politicians will be able to appoint their friends and families so they could do whatever they want at inland revenue? That and God face you will never see in Trinidad and Tobago. So, Mr. Vice President, this is what is at stake here. The rights and freedoms of people. But, Mr. Vice President, we always recognize that there is security and there are rights. We must balance both. We must not go at the extreme of tossing over the rights of the people at the expense of security. Never that must happen in our country. Mr. Vice President, I want to give you the third example of rights being infringed. I go to Section 5 of this legislation. It's a customs amendment. Mr. Vice President, could you imagine? We are not living in Iraq, Syria, or any banana republic. This country is ruled by law. Mr. Vice President, I want you to come with me, journey with me, to Section 5, Roman 2, 2B of this legislation, and read what this government has proposed in this legislation. I want to read for you, Mr. Vice President, what is being proposed. Where an importer receives notice of an adjustment in accordance with subsection 2A, which results in further duties or taxes being payable, and the importer or consignee fails to commence proceedings before the appeal board within 6 months from the date he received notice of the adjustment, the comptroller may refuse entry or delivery of subsequent shipments of the importer or consignee who has not paid the adjustment in addition to commencing proceedings under Section 246 for recovery of same. Mr. Vice President, that is not only draconian, that is oppressive. That is against the people's fundamental rights to property. Sorry about that. Thank you. So, Mr. Vice President, if somebody brings in goods and services or goods here and they are undervalued, and you go and do something and you understand, look, you say you have to pay more. And no, look, in other words, what they're saying, if you fail to commence duties and taxes, they are paying further duty and taxes. That is what it's saying, Mr. Vice President. So if you have been asked to pay further duties and taxes, why are you asking me that if I do not commence proceedings in the tax appeal board, the comptroller of customs is going to have the power to deny me the right to import goods and services into this country as a businessman? This is an attack on the business community of this country. This is what this is. And Mr. Vice President, we have done our research. There has been no consultation with the business community on this provision. That is why we are asking for this matter to be referred to a joint select committee so that businessmen can come before us and deal with this matter. So, Mr. Vice President, we are saying we cannot support such draconian measures. You want to take me to court? Take me to court. You want to take a businessman to court because he under invoice is duties and taxes, and you have now discovered that, and he's refusing? Take him to court. But you cannot refuse the businessman the opportunity of continuing his business. How can you deny the businessman further consignments of the importation of goods? You cannot do that. And we cannot agree to that particular provision. You cannot do that. And I want the Honorable Minister of Trade to speak on this matter, because this is about trade facilitation. And whether we are withholding the second consignment whose documents and papers are not in order. We argue, Mr. Vice President, it's a violation of property rights, and therefore it is unconstitutional. And I want to ask the Honorable Minister of Trade when she speaks, the Honorable Minister that is, whether this is a practice in other CARICOM countries, or is it another case of Trinidad and Tobago doing its own thing against CARICOM, and we are part of CARICOM. Let us know if this exists in other CARICOM countries, Mr. Vice President. You know, Mr. Vice President, that in CARICOM we look for harmony. And therefore, we would like to know whether this amendment is consistent with what obtains in other CARICOM countries. We have done some preliminary investigations, and it is not. This is a standalone arrangement that we have been able to discover, and if we are wrong, we are prepared to be corrected. That is what we would want. It appears this is a hodgepodge, cut and paste arrangement that we have in the legislation before us. And we cannot support those measures, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, we would also like to ask the Honorable Attorney General. I have what is called, on the one hand, Mr. Vice President, we are being told in this section 5, subsection 1A, They are removing the provision that says that you can hold documents from 1 year to 6 years. That is what is the amendment. This amendment is about 6 years now. They move from 1 year to 6 years. But to tell you how this is a hodgepodge, cut and paste arrangement, the government of Trinidad and Tobago forgot that there is a law in Trinidad and Tobago, I think it's 7803, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Vice President. It is a Customs Brokers and Customs Clerk Act. I go to Section 10. Section 10 says that all records and papers described in Subregulation 1 shall be retained and preserved by every customs broker or the employer of a custom clerk for a period of 3 years. So here it is, we are amending the Customs Act from 1 year, Mr. Vice President, to 6 years, but the Customs Brokers and Customs Clerk Act says 3 years. Cut and paste, hodgepodge, and there is no thinking in this piece of legislation. That is why we are asking, Mr. Vice President, it be referred to a joint select committee. The customs brokers are not even aware of these changes that is being proposed here, Mr. Vice President. And therefore, the government has to be very, very careful of what they are doing. We are on all fours with the Honorable Attorney General. We have made it very clear in the UNC, those who do the crime must do the time. And we, like you, are going to follow the money. Because we know a lot of money is going in all directions under your administration. So we too want to follow the money. So we are on all fours with the Honorable Minister, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the Honorable Attorney General referred in his contribution to the FIU. And the FIU is a very important organization. But Mr. Vice President, when I look at the reports of the FIU, they have been crying out for resources, crying out for expertise, crying out for staff, crying out for training. Mr. Vice President, under the watch of this PNM government, suspicious transaction and other activities moved from $5 billion in 2016 to $22 billion in 2017. What is happening, Mr. Vice President? In other words, more criminal activity is taking place under the PNM in Trinidad and Tobago, according to the FIU, than ever before. That is what this is what this is about. More organized drugs. Mr. Vice President, the organized drug trade, the underground economy, the black economy, Mr. Vice President, is alive and well under the PNM. We remember a contractor who imported some $5 million in what? He bring in Bristol board. Bristol board he brought in here. That fella, I understand, was a financier of the PNM. I wouldn't call his name, I know his name. So why doesn't the AG follow the money in that ply board? These are things that are happening under our very eyes. So therefore, if the government is serious, Mr. Vice President, about following the money, there are many things taking place in this country. Follow the money. There's a highway being built from Komuto to Manzanilla. $400 million in the forest. And we are getting information that there's a 10% kickback for the next election. 50 million or 40. That is what Tong is saying. Because people are now saying, Mr. Vice President, this is a highway to nowhere. No, you must investigate that, man. I say those who do the crime must do the time. That's my position. That's the position of the UNC. I'm saying follow the money in terms of the Komuto-Manzanilla Highway. Follow the money. And I have some more information on that as well. But I'm leaving these things for the appropriate time, because time longer than twine. And we will deal with the PNM on the political platform at the appropriate time. We cannot give you everything here, Mr. Vice President. We have to reserve some for the masses who will make a decision on the future of this government called the PNM. So, Mr. Vice President, if you look, Mr. Vice President, at I told you about this document. Trinidad and Tobago is doing very poorly internationally. Very, very poorly. It is trending down in the rule of law. We are, according to this report, out of 113 countries, we are number 48. And we are last in the Caribbean. I think Suriname beat us and Guyana. But after Suriname and Guyana, everybody else ahead of us in terms of the rule of law. Mr. Vice President, may I advise you some of the elements that are used by this international organization in determining how this thing is measured, because we need to understand how this is being measured. Mr. Vice President, how is this thing being measured? It is being measured in the following ways. 1, constraints on governmental powers. 2, absence of corruption. 3, open government. 4, fundamental rights. 5, order and security. 6, regulatory enforcement. 7, civil justice. 8, criminal justice. These are the elements that make up this index. And Trinidad and Tobago in 2017, 2018, recorded a minus 0.01, trending downward in terms of the rule of law. That is what this report is showing, Mr. Vice President. And you cannot come here and bring legislation, Mr. Vice President, to simply, whimsically, and arbitrarily interfere with the rights of the citizens and don't give us justification and a rationale as to why you want to do so. You cannot do that. You will not get the support of the United National Congress in arbitrarily removing the rights of the people in this country. You will not get it. So, Mr. Vice President, there's another area I would like to bring to your attention. It deals with what the Honorable Attorney General dealt with in his final closing remarks. It is on, I'll tell you the actual section, Mr. Vice President. It is section 5, subsection E, subsection 259A. The Honorable Attorney General referred to mutual agreement and treaties involving the United States and Trinidad and Tobago. I want to remind the Attorney General, treaties are approved by the Congress of the United States after a president gives his initial signature. In Trinidad and Tobago, what we are being asked to do here is to give the Minister of Finance the power to engage in any kind of treaty arrangement outside of our jurisdiction. And when he does that and he puts his signature, it will then be subject to a negative resolution. So our rights, our sovereign rights can be signed away by the Minister of Finance or any government minister, in this instance, the Minister of Finance. And Mr. Vice President, the only time you and this Parliament and the people would be aware of it is when they issue a legal notice, and we have under the standing orders 40 days within which to bring a negative resolution to negative or to annul that treaty or that agreement. Mr. Vice President, that is wrong. We do not want any negative resolution. We serve notice, Mr. Vice President, that in the JSE, it will be changed subject to negative to subject to affirmative. We want an affirmative resolution. Before the minister can sign, he must come to this honorable parliament and debate and justify what he is doing on behalf of the citizenry of the Republic of TNT. He cannot go out there whimsically and sell out Trinidad and Tobago and our sovereign rights, and then we have to come and fight through a negative resolution. But you see, the PNM is a very conservative party. They were never interested in modernization. We had standing orders for 53 years with the terms like Governor General, Her Majesty the Queen. It took a UNC administration to revolutionize our standing orders in this country because the government was never interested in making that kind of modernization. I brought a resolution here, Mr. Vice President, a motion for parliamentary autonomy to give the parliament more power and more strength. And what was the response of the PNM? Negative. They're not interested in giving people's power. This is a secret order in the form of a party that runs our country. But I want to tell you, Mr. Vice President, secrecy leads to tyranny. Secrecy leads to tyranny. And any government that is committed to secrecy is committed to hiding things that they don't want the public to know, and that could lead to tyranny and chaos in a country, Mr. Vice President. One of these days we'll talk about the terror plot and how they handle it. But this is not for today. So we are asking, Mr. Vice President, that under 259A, we would like to see this matter of the minister negotiating with a foreign state and possibly signing off our sovereign rights. We would like that to be brought to the Parliament, Mr. Vice. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We would like that to come to the Parliament and be subject to an affirmative resolution. Mr. Vice President, when we return to power very shortly out of office, we will bring about parliamentary autonomy and independence for this Parliament because it was a job in progress. It was interrupted by the PNM. We will have to continue that. And one of the things, Mr. Vice President, that also would be required is revolutionary changes to our Constitution. The Parliament must be entrusted with the power to ratify treaties and any agreement. You can initial those agreements. You can initial treaties, Mr. Vice President, but you must not sign them as the end of the journey. The end of the journey, Mr. Vice President, must come with the Parliament. The Parliament must give its total approval to all treaties and to all decisions that are designed to commit Trinidad and Tobago one way or another to any matter outside of our borders or jurisdictions. So, Mr. Vice President, these are concerns that we have with the legislation that is before us. My time is up, and I just want to reiterate in a very tight way our major concerns. One, this bill contains a number of draconian, oppressive measures. This bill infringes sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution. This bill takes away people's property rights that we cannot sustain and support. And this bill gives to the Minister of Finance power to sign away our sovereign rights as a nation. We are saying that that must come before the Parliament at the first shot or blush via an affirmative resolution, Mr. Vice President. That is what we are proposing and we are suggesting, Mr. Vice President. So, Mr. Vice President, I know that you have to move, and the Honorable Madam President has returned, and I would want to, Madam President, now that you are back, I'm about to take my leave, and I want to thank the Honorable Vice President and yourself for giving me the opportunity to bring to the attention of the government some of our concerns as an opposition, as the alternative government, as the watchdog of the people's rights and freedoms. We brought these concerns, and as the Attorney General has admitted, he's open and he's willing to listen. Only time will tell if that is true or that is false. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Mahabir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, this is a very large bill because it deals with a number of different pieces of legislation. And fortunately, colleagues on my bench will address matters which will not be my focus today. I will not focus, Madam President, on Clause 2, the Mutual Assistance on Criminal Matters Act. I suspect colleagues will focus attention on that. I want, Madam President, to pay some attention to Clause 3 of the bill, the Proceeds of Crime Act as amended. The Proceeds of Crime Act as amended now makes money laundering a summary offense. And it carries with it very heavy penalties. The penalty offense, and on conviction or indictment, to a fine of 50 million and imprisonment for 30 years. So these are really very heavy fines and penalties. The reason in my mind for these very heavy penalties is that there is a need for some deterrence. When one sees a fine of $50 million, one immediately knows that there are serious consequences to engaging in the act of money laundering. But I asked myself, Madam President, a few questions. Who or which agency of the state will actually investigate and prepare the case of money laundering against an individual or maybe even a corporation? Is it the Fraud Squad? Is it the Anti-Corruption Investigations Bureau, ACIB? And while the penalties are indeed draconian, how sure as a society are we that cases will actually be prepared and brought to trial by agencies competent to so do? It would certainly help if we were given some data and information on how many cases similar to these have been prepared, at least for prosecution, and were successfully prosecuted. How much, of course, time would it take to prepare a case of money laundering? And with your leave, Madam President, I know the Attorney General has, in fact, referred to Clause 45 of the Proceeds of Crime Act. And I want to repeat again. 45(1) says, a person who knows or has reasonable grounds to suspect that property is criminal property and who, B, receives, possesses, conceals, disposes of, disguises, transfers, brings into, or sends out of Trinidad and Tobago that criminal property, commits an offense of money laundering. So the legislation itself is really very wide. But, Madam President, since we are now making this particular offense a summary offense in addition to an indictable offense, carrying a very large penalty in the summary courts of $25 million and imprisonment for 15 years, I had cause to refer to the Summary Offences Act. And again, with your leave, Madam President, when I examined the Summary Offences Act, Clause 42, Clause 42 says, all cases punishable under this Act, and I refer to 42D, all cases punishable under this Act of receiving any chattel or money or valuable security, knowing it to have been stolen or otherwise unlawfully come by or obtained, may be prosecuted at any time within 12 months after the commission of the offense. So what I saw in the Summary Offences Act, Clause 42, 42D in particular,
is a time limitation for an offense which is identical to 45(1)(b, receives criminal property, and here he's receiving property that is unlawfully come by. And I was simply wondering whether the provisions of 42D, and I'm sure the Attorney General will address this issue, whether the provision of 42D, which imposes a time limitation of 1 year, within 12 months from the commission of the offense, will be waived in this particular piece of legislation on the Proceeds of Crime Act. Because, Madam President, when one looks at the history of prosecuting white-collar crime in Trinidad and Tobago, money crimes, we know it takes time to prepare the case. And if a loophole exists where an individual has the option of either summary or indictable, and his lawyer says, well, it is going to be tried in the summary courts, the authorities must present that case within 12 months of the date the offense is alleged to have been committed. And if they can't do that, then it is possible that we have, Madam President, a very heavy penalty of $15 million, and it's on summary conviction, a fine of $25 million, and imprisonment for 15 years. But the probability of someone ever being convicted in the summary courts of money laundering seems, given the current state of our investigative arms in this type of crime, the probability seems to be zero. And it appears to me that we would have a law, we are in this parliament, going to pass a piece of legislation, the enforcement of which is going to be extremely difficult or almost impossible. Similar to the death penalty. The death penalty is on the books, but simply for the state to execute is going to be, it has been a great challenge. And so I want to recommend, I have not tabled any amendments. I leave it entirely up to the judgment of the Honorable Attorney General. I would want to recommend, if in fact a loophole exists with respect to what is contained in the Summary Offences Act and what we are proposing in the Proceeds of Crime Act, I want to propose to the Attorney General for his consideration that in section 53(1), when we are saying on summary conviction to a fine of $25 million, and B, on conviction on indictment to a fine of $50 million and to imprisonment of 30 years, I am recommended a section C, where 42D of the Summary Offences Act does not apply in this instance. Because, Madam President, my concern is a loophole exists. And a good lawyer or any attorney, I'm not a lawyer at all, and I'm seeing a loophole. So I am saying, if I am convicted of money laundering under the Proceeds of Crime Act, I immediately will tell my attorney, I want to be tried under the summary offenses, and I play for time. A year would elapse, and given the passage of a year, I would say, well, the time period has elapsed, and therefore I go free. And I'm sure the Attorney General will address that particular concern. You see, Madam President, the FCB IPO is still hanging. That is white-collar crime. We have had so much white-collar crime in Trinidad and Tobago, and we know it takes time to prepare the case. So I really would be comforted in defending the public interest if the Attorney General can advise what are the steps taken by the state to ensure that the investigations on money laundering can be conducted in a timely manner. Which arm of the state? Because right now I am not sure whether it's the fraud squad or the ACIB or the director, who actually is doing the investigation on money laundering. I know with respect to securities fraud, it is the SEC, and they haven't really brought a case to prosecution ever in the 20 years of their history. And so I am not sure that we will be able to prosecute anyone, but as a deterrent, if the draconian penalties identified by Senator Mark certainly should act as a signal that the state is very serious about these offenses. So I really would like to hear what the AG would say with respect to the time limitations and the meshing of the Summary Offences Act with the Proceeds of Crime Act. Madam President, let me focus on Clause 5, which is the Customs Act. And in the Customs Act, I too looked at the Customs Act 2B, if according to the bill we have under Clause 5, 2B. It says that, and Senator Mark did read it out, but I would read because I want to propose an amendment for the consideration of the Attorney General. It says, where an importer receives notice of an adjustment in accordance with subsection 2A, which results in further duties or taxes being payable, and the importer or consignee fails to commence proceedings before the appeal board within 6 months from the date he received notice of the adjustment, the controller may refuse entry of delivery. I want to propose that, and the importer or consignee fails to commence proceedings before the appeal board within 6 months from the date he received notice of the adjustment without just cause. Right now, the controller of customs may, not that he shall, he may refuse cargo, perhaps which are en route already from being landed and sent to the importer. And I think it is important to provide the importer, the consignee, some kind of recourse as to why he did not pay the duties on the one hand, and because we are talking, Madam President, of a 6-year period. Someone imported into Trinidad and Tobago a container on which the customs has now indicated there was under-invoicing, therefore duties which were due to be paid to the state were not duly paid to the state. That was in January of 2012. It was found out today, 6 years later, that this situation has arisen. But between 2012 and now, a number of things could have happened to the consignee or the importer. Reasonably, he could have retired and someone else has taken over the business, and in the transition, they have not had the time to look at this particular matter. The importer may have fallen ill, the importer may have died, and the business may have been sold. So I think that if we were to impose the penalty, but provide the importer or now an individual who may have inherited the business or who now owns the business an opportunity to show just cause why he did not initiate proceedings before the appeal board within 6 months, then his attorney, his legal representative, can indicate that we are not disregarding your notice, but there are extenuating circumstances which warrant the delay, and we therefore would want you to allow our containers to be imported, our duties to be paid, and we will be addressing the matter. You see, as it reads, Madam President, the controller of customs may refuse entry. And I would like to know the conditions, what is going to guide him or her on refusing the entry of new cargo. Is it that he asked for a bribe and it was not paid, and he says, oh, the law tells me I may and therefore I will? Or is it that it is left up to judgment? I would like some fetters to be placed, and I would like the importer, as errant as he or she may be, to be given an opportunity to show just cause as to why he did not initiate the proceedings or the appeal, why he did not pay the duties in the first instance. He may not have, he may perhaps didn't pay the duty, he perhaps is now emerging out of bankruptcy. Madam President, there has to be an addition there of just cause. And I would like the Attorney General to give that some consideration. Madam President, I want to focus on the Exchange Control Act as amended. Bearer negotiable instruments. A similar situation arose when we were debating a while back, I think you were in the chair, the interest payments on judgment debts. At the time the bill was dutifully passed, the government proposed to reduce the interest rate from 12% to 5%. And the question that arose was simply, okay, what is the rationale and what is the anchor? From what I recall in that debate, my own, and it has bearings to what I am going to come to, I wish to assure you. What I did propose was that when we in law make these kinds of adjustments, we should anchor them for transparency and for the removal of arbitrariness. My own proposal then was that we link the interest rate that is to be paid on a judgment debt to the repo rate administered by the central bank. Central bank is an arm of the state, quasi-independent arm of the state, and it's an objective rate. I recall my colleague, Senator Shriki, soon indicating that I think he would have preferred to see the rate anchored to the prime rate. And we did debate as to whether it should be prime or repo, but there was no debate on an anchor. We said it should be anchored on something that is transparent. So Madam President, I want to link that to what is being proposed in Clause 6, the Exchange Control Act. In Clause 6, there is the provision that if someone imports or has any one of these negotiable instruments, a bank draft, a negotiable bond of 5,000 US or 20,000 TT in currency. Well, I can't see the relationship between 5,000 US and 20,000 TT. It violates, Madam President, something in my field, and you must forgive me, I don't always get the opportunity to practice some economics in the Senate. So I will take this opportunity because it has direct bearing. There is a concept in economics known as purchasing power parity, PPP. What does PPP say? It is the basis for exchange rate determination. And my colleagues who were a student of mine, Senator Obika was a former student who would have gone through this, and other economists here would understand, Senator Henry teaches the subject, that there is a relationship between exchange rates based upon this thing known as PPP. And we ask ourselves, if 5,000 US is spent on a bundle of goods in the United States, how much would it cost to purchase that bundle in Trinidad and Tobago? Is it going to be $20,000 or is it going to be $30,000? Well, that's a Big Mac. Senator Khan understands the Big Mac exchange extremely well. It's PPP. The reason our exchange rate, Madam President, is what it is that it says that if something costs 5,000 US in the United States, it should cost at a rate of exchange of 7 to 1, 35,000 in Trinidad. Because if it does not, there will be flows of goods and services to bring the rate back eventually into that PPP dynamic. At 5,000 US and 20,000 TT, the Honorable Attorney General is implicitly imposing an exchange rate of 4 TT for 1 US. And I would recommend, if we are to respect at least nominal exchange rates in Trinidad and Tobago, it should at least be 5,000 US and 30,000 TT. It makes more sense, and it respects the current existing nominal exchange rate arrangements that we have. That is, so 5 and 30 in my mind makes more sense than 5 and 20. 5,000 US, 20,000 TT should be 5,000 US, and I think 30,000 TT, so that there will be some parity with respect to the value of both instruments. But Madam President, my issue is not just with that. It is with what is standard practice and harmonization. In Trinidad and Tobago, whenever an individual has an instrument in excess of 60,000 TT, if it is $59,999 and he wishes to make a deposit in a bank, he does not have to sign a declaration on the source of funds. The regulations issued by the central bank says 60,000 and over. And if you have a bank draft of 60,000 and over, you are going to have to declare the source of funds. Anything less than that is free of that regulation. And in addition, when one undertakes foreign travel, you travel to Canada or the United States, in the customs declaration, they ask whether you have any instruments in excess of 10,000 Canadian or 10,000 US. And if it is in excess, you do have to declare it and sign the form and make the necessary declarations. If it is less, you don't have to do it. So I think that if we are to harmonize with respect to international norm and banking practices locally, the figures here under the Exchange Control Act should really be 10,000 US and 60,000 TT. I raise this purely for the consideration of the Honorable Attorney General. And if he is keeping with his 5,000 US as the limit, as the limit for these bearer negotiable instruments, which would have to be declared, I recommend it be 5,000 US and 30,000 TT. 5 and 20 simply do not follow the Big Mac index that Senator Khan has alluded to. Madam President, I was very short, and I just raised these matters for the attention of the Attorney General. Thank you very much.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Madam President, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to join in this debate. My presentation will also be very focused on some limited issues, and I will give my colleagues the opportunity to deal with the others. Madam President, Trinidad and Tobago recognized as early as 1997 that it required to engage in a global approach to tackling certain criminal activities plaguing the country. Undoubtedly, its decision to do so would have been influenced by global pressures because we do have obligations to the rest of the globe, but I have no doubt that it would also have been influenced by the fact that we recognized that the battle against certain crimes cannot be tackled by any individual country. It has to be done on a more global scale. And if that was applicable in 1997, it is even more applicable now. To this end, Trinidad and Tobago introduced the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act in 1997. This act allows for the provision of assistance to Commonwealth and via a process to non-Commonwealth countries. More importantly, from my perspective, it allows Trinidad and Tobago to receive such assistance from other countries on the basis of reciprocity. And my focus is not so much on our obligation to our international partners, but what we can receive in return under the legislation, because we do need the assistance of the world in combating these crimes. Historically, many of the requests we see from Trinidad and Tobago, especially from the United States of America, were mainly drug-related. Over the years, we have received numerous requests from various jurisdictions, including the United Kingdom and Great Britain, the United States of America, Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, Israel, Singapore, Norway, Spain, and CARICOM. Major crimes such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, money laundering, and tax evasion have spawned international criminals who are not limited by physical boundaries and do not contain their activity to a specific jurisdiction. The world is their crime scene, and as such, the authorities in a single jurisdiction are out of their depth in seeking to address the activities of such persons. They are constrained by issues. These authorities in any individual country are constrained by issues of sovereignty and jurisdiction. And this creates a losing proposition because on the one hand, you have an international criminal who is not constrained by borders, and on the other side, you have government or a nation that is so constrained by borders and sovereignty. So we have to overcome that and level the playing field if the authorities in any country is to have any hope of combating this scourge. The international criminal knows no boundaries, and no country has a realistic chance to combat international crime. So we have to look beyond boundaries and adjust the normal approach to sovereignty. Since 2002, a meeting in Fort-de-France, Martinique, it was recognized that an urgent need existed to strengthen international legal cooperation within the Caribbean. So we are bringing it closer to home. The seminar addressed the challenges that the Caribbean faced from the growth of drug trafficking, the increase in international organized crime, and the threat of terrorism. This seminar recognized the need within the Caribbean for mutual assistance in criminal matters. Our legislation allows us to provide and, as I said, more importantly for me, enables us to receive such assistance. It allows us, one, to obtain government-to-government assistance in criminal investigations and prosecutions, and two, to identify and recover proceeds of crime, that is, literally to follow the money. While the main focus of the legislation and mutual assistance activity to date has been in respect of acts that threaten our physical well-being, that is, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and terrorism, financial crimes are more and more becoming a focus on the global stage, as they threaten the financial well-being of the many for the benefit of the few, and they also finance the activities that threaten our physical well-being. As such, crimes such as money laundering and tax evasion are receiving more and more attention. And this, of course, is of particular interest to me. If we are minded to believe that even with a vastly improved tax authority and an efficiently functioning financial intelligence unit, that Trinidad and Tobago can tackle issues like tax evasion and money laundering on its own, we have merely to consider the recent findings and rulings in respect of countries that fall under the jurisdiction of such powerhouses like the IRS. Even entities like the IRS, which is globally viewed as an entity to be feared, has acknowledged that it needs international assistance in identifying these kinds of crimes with respect to its citizens. Recently, for example, the European Union Commission ruled against Apple in a tax matter, determining that it owed $14.5 billion in back taxes related to its business in Europe and Ireland. At the same time, the United States of America is accusing Apple of shielding $74 billion in profits over the last 4 years. A gentleman by the name of Clint Mandock, a breaking news reporter for the International Business News, an online Newsweek publication, stated in an article on October 6, 2015, as follows: America's largest companies are harboring more than $2.1 trillion in profits overseas to avoid paying taxes statewide. The accumulated profits, if repatriated from places like Bermuda, Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, would amount to an estimated $620 billion in U.S. tax revenue. The study, which was reported by Reuters, was able to calculate those figures by reviewing Securities and Exchange Commission filings from the companies. Around 3/4 of the Fortune 500 companies, he claimed, take advantage of the tax havens abroad. The names on the list are recognizable to many. At the top was Apple, which he claimed, or which was reported, had kept out of its tax filings an amount totaling $1.8 billion. Microsoft holds offshore $1.3 billion in 5 tax havens. Switzer, 74 billion and 151 tax havens. General Electric has around $109 billion overseas in tax havens. What is the relevance of this to us? At least one of these countries is operating in Trinidad. One of these companies is operating in Trinidad. And if it is depriving the US under the ambit of the IRS of income, should we not assume that we are also potentially being deprived of income that we should be receiving through taxes? Tax evasion, Mr. Mindock wrote, is a big problem for the IRS. It keeps billions out of the federal coffers each year. The issue clearly benefits the wealthiest members of society, as they are the only ones capable of taking advantage of the tax evasion opportunities. The practice has been criticized for fueling inequality, since it allows the rich to amass further wealth. It is hardly a problem just for the United States. Countries such as France and Spain also have publicly dealt with tax fraud and tax evasion recently. So this is a problem that has been recognized globally by, as I said, powerhouses of tax authorities like the IRS. If matters like this do not persuade us that little Trinidad and Tobago needs help in combating international crime, including the crime of tax evasion, then I don't know what will. And as criminals get more sophisticated, so must our laws. This is why we must return to Parliament at this time, seeking amendments to the legislation so that we can keep up with the activity of the criminals and be able to combat those activities as they become more and more sophisticated. So, among the amendments that the draft bill is proposing is an amendment that opens the door to allow Trinidad and Tobago to share and via reciprocity to receive information related to criminal offenses under the tax laws. And the first one I will look at is the one that Senator Mark and to a lesser extent Senator Mahabir paid attention to. At the moment, the legislation allows us to refuse, this is Trinidad and Tobago, it allows us to refuse to provide information in relation to crimes under a tax law unless the offense is committed by way of an intentionally incorrect statement or intentional failure to declare income derived from any offense covered by the Convention on Mutual Assistance. This sets the bar really high because it suggests to me that the country seeking the assistance of its international partners needs to establish the basis for that request on a bar that seems similar to a criminal intent matter, and therefore it renders receiving information on tax offenses to be very difficult. And so in that context, dealing with the matter of tax evasion on an international scale is very difficult. So we are trying to adjust that bar to make it easier for us to receive information on tax evasion matters. If we are to successfully combat this crime, we have to be able to more freely share and receive information and other assistance. As stated, persons who commit such crimes operate with no national borders. If tax and other authorities continue to be hamstrung by those borders, the criminals will win every time. The amendment, therefore, seeks to allow for the freer sharing of information in respect of tax matters. When you look at the challenges that we are currently facing in terms of our tax collection, this problem that we need to address and the need to address the problem comes into sharper focus. For example, Professor Theodore in 2017 prepared a report which indicated that the inland revenue is under collecting tax revenue by $15 billion. In doing that report, he focused on corporation and income tax and VAT. in respect of activity occurring within Trinidad and Tobago. So, let us, when we put that in the context of the fact that Trinidad nationals are required to declare income on their worldwide profits, that $15 million, in my estimation, is an understatement, because it doesn't take account of the activity conducted outside of Trinidad and Tobago by Trinidad citizens who are required to, when they earn income outside, to bring it in and declare it and pay tax on it. When you also put that in the context of the fact that the Board of Inland Revenue collected in 2017 $37 billion, and you consider that $15 billion is at least what they failed to collect, you will see what we're talking about in terms of magnitude and the impact it would have on Trinidad and Tobago if we allow the authorities more power to go after the money that is being kept out of the Treasury illegally. We have lots of avenues of this happening. We have withholding tax that we should be collecting from foreigners who provide services in Trinidad. A lot of it we don't collect. It was easier to collect when we had the exchange control provisions and you had to apply to the central bank for approval to buy foreign exchange. And so every application that went to the central bank for approval, you had to get the Board of Inland Revenue to confirm that you had paid your withholding tax. With the removal of the requirement for that application process, the ability for us to identify and ensure collection of withholding tax basically disappeared. It's very much on an honor system with the limited checks and balances brought about by the audits that the Board of Inland Revenue will conduct from time to time. So that is a huge hole that we need to fill, and if we are allowed to collect information from our international partners, we may be able to come some way in addressing that. We have international companies that earn income in Trinidad. The tax that they have to pay in respect of that income is largely based on a voluntary compliance basis. So they tell us how much income they earn, they tell us what their expenses are. Yes, we have the ability to conduct audits, but we are dealing with the world of the likes of Apple and the likes of GE and the likes of Amazon, who have the wherewithal to be able to control what we see, to determine what kinds of invoices we get, to set prices between one another so that they have a company, a related company, based in a low tax or no tax jurisdiction, imposing a huge cost on services to a Trinidad company. So the Trinidad company's profits are very low, and the profits are siphoned into the low tax jurisdiction. How do we combat that if we try to do it on our own? We need to be able to more easily access information that will allow us to properly assess the real profits earned by these international companies. We have a report indicating that the oil companies have been significantly understating their income by billions of dollars each year. How do we get that information in a way that allows us to collect the correct amounts of taxes due from these companies if we cannot seek the assistance of our international neighbors? And we cannot seek that unless we are prepared to reciprocate and provide them with information. And this is why we are seeking to amend the legislation to lower the bar for the provision of tax information to our international companies so that we can, by reciprocity, receive that kind of information from them to allow us to properly collect the taxes due not only from nationals, but from international players who operate in the country. That is essential. So I would recommend to you a reconsideration by any of you who are minded to object to that clause. I would ask you to revisit your consideration of that and give us the support that we need to get that in place so we can enhance and tighten our tax compliance activity. Moving on to the next provision that was discussed. Duties and taxes on importation by customs. So duties and taxes on importation and exportation are based on the value of goods. Currently, the tax that we collect, the way the system operates, it's based on an honor system. The importer declares his value, and because of the process, because of the volume faced by customs, and for various other reasons, more often than not, the value proposed by the importer is accepted by customs, and the goods are imported on that basis, on a system. There are some checks and balances in place, but they are inadequate. At the moment, the customs and the controller has the opportunity to revisit the value accepted by a customs officer and adjust that value, but he must do that within a year of the importation. We are saying that this is not a sufficient period. The intention of the government, as we have clearly indicated, is to move towards the introduction of a revenue authority. The revenue authority, one of the things it will do is allow for and promote and encourage greater synergies between the two main revenue collection organs of the state. It will encourage things like, or promote things like joint audits and other compliance activity. The Board of Inland Revenue, in its legislation, may raise an assessment against a taxpayer where it discovers that that taxpayer has understated its income within a 6-year period. So the board currently has 6 years, and it can even go beyond 6 years if it can establish that there's fraud or willful neglect. So let's stick with the 6-year limit. So we'll have a situation where you can have a customs officer and a Board of Inland Revenue officer going out to a customer, identifying that there has been a problem and under declaration of goods on importation and so on, that yes, impacts the Board of Inland Revenue's activity and so may lead to an adjustment in the tax assessment, but also impacts the duty that should have been paid in respect of customs.
Minister.
Why not?
Minister. Honourable members, at this stage we will take the break and we will return at 5 p.m. Minister, you've used up 22 minutes of your speaking time. So we are suspended until 5 p.m.